Okay, hello everyone. It's nice to see you all again. Thank you for coming to the fifth session of our virtual conference series. Today we have Bruna Picas Prats talking today, giving her talk on rest and completion in the end of the science of logic. Bruna is a PhD student at the University of Barcelona, writing on the end of the logic and the role of the dialectic in the end. Bruna, please.
Okay, good. Thank you everybody for coming today, and many thanks for the organizing for arranging this amazing conference series. It is it is a very important opportunity for me, because what I bring here today is more or less what the topic of my doctoral thesis, and therefore it is very important for me to share it and to receive some feedback to see if something here works or not, or if it makes any sense actually. You will see that it is based on Angelica Nudzu's article, The End of Hegel's Logic, Absolute Idea as Absolute Method. It is not actually like a criticize or a denying of it. It's just another point of view, or another further analysis that can be followed from there. Okay, then I'll read, because I don't feel very comfortable yet talking about Hegel in English, which is not my mother language. Then I'll read it. I'm sorry, but I hope that it will be clear enough. And well, I start. Thank you for everybody. Okay, then, as I said, my contribution is based on Angelica Nudzu's article, The End of Hegel's Logic, Absolute Ideas, Absolute Method. And in this paper, she remarks that in Hegel's logic, absolute idea admits a possibility of the intervention of a rest, in German übrig, das Übrige, that prevents his first part of the system from reaching its end. However, for Hegel, as Nudzu points out, the science of logic can be closed due to the emergence of the absolute method, which drives the foundation and completion of the system to being a circle of circles. That is, the rise of the absolute method ensures that the logic is free of any remaining apertures. Otherwise, the logical development is at risk of being arbitrary, unconscious, and condemned to fall into the form of bad infinity, an infinite regress, making it incapable of reaching its end. Nevertheless, the aim of my contribution is to defend that the final achievement of the circle of circles can also be read as an openness instead of a closure of Hegel's logic, and therefore of his whole system, because it is always possible for the rest to remain. With that, I suggest a point of view in which the possibility of an openness does not invalidate Hegel's philosophy, but can rather be seen as its strength or value. To argue that, I think that it is necessary to provide an account for two aspects. In the first place, to demonstrate why Hegel's logic remains open and with that incomplete. And in the second place, to show how this openness can be the logic's strength, even though Hegel's intention is commonly assumed to be an opposite one. And therefore, my inquiry here is the following. Firstly, by examining how the method is able to defeat external reflection, and with that, this rest, a deeper question can be formulated. Why does the analytic synthetic dialectical method that provides this dynamic and immanent advance of the logic need a closure? That is, an achievement of an end. Secondly, the form of this end is a circular one, which can be represented by good infinity in the doctrine of being, or concrete universality in the doctrine of concept. However, why is it that good infinity or concrete universality could not be thought as open as well, that is, allowing the rest to remain? To treat these issues, I am going to carry out the following steps. In the first place, I am going to examine what it means for the absolute method to overcome the rest that the absolute idea entails. I will do so by using Nudo's articles on the one hand, because it is an excellent analysis of Hegel's last chapter of the logic, which is the one that is at stake here. And on the other hand, because she states that the emergence of the absolute method is able to overcome the erroneous rest that the absolute idea entails by introducing a retrospective perspective in which all the moments of the logic are rearranged. In the second place, I will expose the main point of my contribution, which is twofold. Firstly, by trying to sustain a reading in which this rest is not fully sublevated, and secondly, by giving a further treatment to the implication that the remaining of the rest implies a failure of Hegel's logic of becoming a systematic science. To do so, I will have to clarify why an openness of the logic does not have to lead necessarily to a simple or unilateral conception of arbitrariness or error. To develop this standpoint, it will be indispensable to define the difference of what I understand by openness, closure, and completion of Hegel's system. This will allow me to suggest an interpretation in which the Hegelian method's truth and the whole truth of the logic could be read as provided by the permanence of the rest. With that, my intention is to defend that the openness of Hegel's logic does not imply incompleteness. Such an implication, in my understanding of Nudo's paper, is not presenting her conclusion. I will try to sustain that for the logic to be complete, it must remain open by an enclosing and self-differentiating bridge. Finally, I will point and only point a twofold consequence regarding the architectonics of Hegel's system and concerning the Hegelian textual corpus that I consider that Nudo's reading of the final chapter of the Science of Logic can entail. With that, I start with the main content. Then, to begin, I am going to examine what it means for the absolute method to overcome the rest that the absolute idea entails. We find ourselves right now at the end of the logic, which means that the logic is reaching its conclusion. In her article, Nudo introduces the analysis of this part by posing the two following questions, which I think that have a crucial role for my inquiry. And I quote, why and how must the logic come to an end and to which end? And more generally and methodologically, what is the end taken absolutely or schlechthin, das Ende, i.e. close quote. To answer these questions, it is necessary to take a step back and provide a general account about why for Hegel the logic is a science of logic. Hegel's aim of writing the logic has a Kantian origin. And yeah, as Kant states in the Architectonics of the Pure Reason, for a discipline to be a science, it means that, in the first place, all the parts that constitute it have to be justified, and these parts have to be systematically articulated in the sense of articulatio by an idea, namely an inner order. In Kant's words, and I open quote, a systematic unity is that which first makes ordinary cognition into a science. It makes the system out of a mere aggregate of it. And I understand by a system, however, the unity of the manifold cognitions under one idea. I close quote. Notwithstanding, it is Fichte who inspires Hegel's ideal of the logic as a science. Hegel will defend then that the science of logic implies a unification of the form and the content, and that it is Fichte's doctrine of science, Fichte's doctrine of science is axiological prior to the formal logic, because it is the logic which would draw its validity from the doctrine of science and not other way around. Moreover, Hegel has a capital debt to Fichte, because it is Fichte who builds the framework in which philosophy ceases to be a love of wisdom and becomes a science, namely concluded knowledge. In Fichte's terms, and I open quote, philosophy is a science that has to constitute a unity, being a whole, I close quote. Conventionally, the title of Hegel's Science of Logic is taken to exemplify this pretension. Also, Hegel adds to the Kantian and to the Fichtean formulations that the aim of the science is to reach the absolute knowledge, absolutism, which had originally been lost in the predicative forms of the understanding. In summary, Hegel inherits the following demands from Kant and Fichte. In the first place, that all the parts of the science are articulated by an inner order of idea, which this implies that there cannot be any part of the science that remains unjustified or unnecessary, because it would contain arbitrary parts, and it would not be a systematic science anymore. And therefore, Hegel's science of logic has to be very special science, because it cannot contain postulates, axioms, prejudices, nor presuppositions. In other words, it cannot contain any unjustified starting points. With that, the most operational methodological form to achieve these demands is brought about in a very Wolffian manner, which is to make a system with a syllogistic form, where premises and conclusion constitute a whole. The logic needs an overarching conclusion in a methodological sense. Otherwise, the logic, on the one hand, would be a mere aggregate of arguments, and on the other hand, it would admit further infinite arbitrary parts, causing it to be governed by external reflection and transitory opinion. With the respect, further difficulties emerge. For example, if to be a science, the logic requires a conclusion which is understood as an end, then what kind of end is Hegel referring to? If so, could the end of the logic be considered as merely another moment of the logic? Or could it be considered, for instance, in a negative form, that is, as the negation of all moments? These are some of the first difficulties that follow from the emergence of the absolute idea. With the logic, the moment that constitutes its end, as we all know, is the chapter of the absolute idea. At this standpoint, the inner order required to conform a systematic science is made explicit. In its immediate presentation, the absolute idea emerges as a result of the idea of truth and the idea of good, the two moments of finite cognition. And the most relevant issue here is that the absolute idea is really a result. The absolute idea is a result, and for this reason, it depends on its preceding moments. Therefore, it loses its absoluteness because it is relative to all the other moments of the logical development. That is, it is dependent on the rest. And as a result, the absolute idea is a single particular moment, a determination, and any determination in the very moment that presents itself implies otherness. The idea is supposed to have incorporated its otherness as its content, and for this reason, it should be absolute, but in the very moment that presents itself as such, is not absolute anymore. Therefore, in order to keep the absoluteness gained, it seems intuitive to think that the idea has to negate its dependence on other movements and to vindicate itself as a non-dependent free subjective concept determined and for itself, that is, become truly absolute. As Hegel states in the first paragraph of the absolute idea, and I open quote, this quote is like the most important quote, one of the most important, and I open quote, the concept is not only soul, but free subjective concept that exists for itself and therefore has personality. The practical objective concept that is determined in and for itself and is as person impenetrable atomic subjectivity, but which is not just the same exclusive singularity. It is rather explicitly universality and cognition, and in its other has its own objectivity for its subject matter. Otherwise, and I close quote, and otherwise, if the idea is not a result, it would therefore negate being a part of the whole logical development that constitutes logic. Therefore, as we can see in the first paragraph of the chapter of the absolute idea, I open quote, all the rest, that is not the idea itself, is error, confusion, opinion, striving, arbitrariness, and transitoriness. The absolute idea alone is being imperishable life, self-knowing truth, and is all truth. I close quote. The idea is supposed to be able to end the logic because it is in and for itself, because it is universality and cognition, and it is other and has its own objectivity for its subject matter. Notwithstanding this first appearance of the idea, in which supposedly the highest form of truth arises, the deepest realm of negativity also intervenes. And as Nuzzo states, and I open quote, the idea is provided really absolute and absolutely necessary if and only if, without it, or set merely in opposition to it, all preceding forms, and even the logic as a whole, can be reduced to the sheer negativity of that rest. I close quote. At this point, where the idea is supposed to provide the logic's end and conclusion, at the same time, it has to deal with all the rest. Therefore, it implies that the absolute idea contains within it the highest opposition. Namely, we have alle Wahrheit, all the truth, and against alles Übrige, all the rest. Retaking Nuzzo's quote, and I open quote, which means precisely that up to this point, no real absoluteness has been gained, and I close quote. If this opposition has not been somehow overcome, the logic and the system are endangered to remain open, and with that, at risk of being invaded by arbitrariness, error, Trieb and Schreiben, and not being able to be a systematic science in the sense defended before. Then, in her article, Nuzzo formulates the following question. How can the idea maintain its character of being absolute if there is a still realm of total negativity, which remains as a rest located in front of the absolute idea? And Nuzzo's position in this respect is that this rest can be overcome if a synoptic and retrospective perspective is incorporated. What provides this enriched standpoint if the emergence of the absolute is the emergence of the absolute method, which is the inner order of the logical development, is not only an idea, but a method. Therefore, Hegel's logic is a systematic science governed by a method. This turn is what will allow the logic to reach its end. The only way to incorporate this end unproblematically is by regarding it not only as the final point of a perspective progression, but also as the departure point of the retrospection or reconstruction of the whole logical process, in which all the moments are presented as necessary parts of it. According to Nuzzo, Hegel's reasoning of the final chapter of the science of logic is the following. The sublimation of the immediacy of the absolute idea is to realize that the idea is the method of the logic, that is, its form. The development of this last moment is the syllogism of the method, and in its immediate presentation, which is the one that first appeared, the method is form. Its mediation will consist in realizing that the method is the content of the logic as well. And with that, the logic will show itself as the method of the system or absolute method. Method, as form, considers the logical process in terms of beginning and advancement, which is also the immediate understanding of the logic. The conclusion of this moment is that the method is analytic and synthetic at the same time, that is prospective and retrospective. This means that the result of the analysis is a synthesis, and with that, the result of the progressive process is to have gained the point of view from which, at the same time, we reconstruct the whole process. This standpoint makes explicit the inner order with the logic with which the logic can become a science. And at this point, Nuzzo remarks that there is a change of sequences. The emergence of the method interrupts the prospective and immanent logical sequence, establishes any relationship between the logical determinations and their foundation. Now, The method has reformed the whole logical development and provided a new methodological relation between the beginning and the advancement. This implies that, and I open quote, what is essential for science is not so much that the beginning be a pure immediacy, but rather that the whole of the science itself is a circulation, Kreislauf, in itself, wherein the first is also the last and the last is also the first. And I close quote. Turning the logical development into a circle. The last turn of the method's reflection tells us that if we rebuild and reconsider the logic from its end, we will become aware that the logic is not only methodological, namely method in its form, but also contentfully method. That is, the logic is itself the method of the system. The conclusion of the syllogism of method is to rearrange the logical process, now with methodological eyes. That is, we are now in the position to understand that the logic is the method of the system, which is itself methodologically built. And right now, the method is articulated in function of its own content, and it becomes systematically scientific itself, achieving Kant's comprehension of science. I understand it like in this way, at least. And well, now the conclusion of the logic is at stake. And in the first place, a method is at the same time the immanent production and reflexive knowledge of the result of the syllogism. And in the second place, from the formal syllogism, we deduce the content of the method, and with that, beginning and advancement have been mutually connected. And right now, with this process, the indeterminate and simple beginning becomes determinate. This implies that it is no longer mere form, but demonstrated content. Notwithstanding, the analysis is not done yet. Even though it looks like the logic is conclusive, we have also acquired a new beginning. And with that, there is still the possibility of an aperture to remain. That is, if we could start the whole process again with the same methodological issues with the indeterminate beginning and so on. Here, Nuzzo notes a double threat. There's in the first one, and there is a risk for the mediation of the end to entail an open ending with the form of an inconclusive demonstration. And this first danger involves a second one, which consists in a transposition of this aperture onto a new beginning, which would bring the entire logic to an infinite regress. Then every conclusion reached becomes, in turn, a new as the former one. With that, what had to be a syllogistic conclusive end is transformed into an infinite regress. Nevertheless, for Nuzzo, the absoluteness of the method allows the logic to reach its end without an open ending and without an infinite regress in of the retrospective perspective in which end and beginning are connected. As said, from this standpoint, all the has its own content. I understand this conclusive mediative points of view that raises awareness of the inner concept, making the logic the methodologically proven method of the system. In the last paragraph of the article, Nuzzo claims that due to the incorporation of this last mediation, the absolute method does not admit the possibility of a permanence of this rest, that is, error, confusion, arbitrariness, etc., while the absolute idea does. With that, I hope to have offered a clear explanation of how the absolute method is supposed to defeat the threat for the logic to remain open. And having exposed briefly Nuzzo's point in the reference paper, I am going to share my reading of my promise of the promised issues, and well, a little bit like what I understand with all this framework at stake here. And yeah, okay. Here I offer a point of view in which I want to sustain that relative to Nutz's reading here, there is a step farther that can be taken. I think that the analysis of the sublimation of the rest by the emergence of the method has not yet finished. This attempt is relevant because I believe that it has been presupposed that a conclusive closure implies a completion. Moreover, I want to remark that what makes a logic to be a science is not in virtue of its closure, but of its completion, and its completion requires an openness. To do so, I am going to focus on what Nietzsche calls the second moments of the form of the method, which are the dialectical ones. The moments of the logic are transversal and simultaneously, in the first place, an immediate presentation, second place, mediation, and in the third place, mediated term. Nietzsche states with textual support that what all the second moments of the logic have in common is that they are contradictions through which the advance is carried out. With that, mediation implies always a contradiction, that is, everything that is posed or determined in Hegel's system reveals a negative presence. The negative presence is not sublimated until it is not recognized as such, and therefore it is enriched in a completer and more concreter form. What I understand that interests Nietzsche at this point is how Hegel makes a step farther to the dialectical moment of the method. This moment comes with the synoptic view provided by the emergence of the absolute method, which indicates that the dialectic has to be recognized even when there is no logical succession and even if its succession has been reconfigured by the method syllogism. Precisely, this prevalence of the dialectical moment is what constitutes the medium and the content of the logic itself. I understand these aspects as designating a twofold perspective, in which, on the one hand, external reflection and immediacy are sublimated into a mediated form, and on the other hand, this sublimation does not only consist in erasing the emerging contradiction, but in understanding the mediation, and that the mediation always provides an awareness that knowledge requires contradiction and opposition. In my opinion, Nietzsche's emphasis on mediation is a little too Kantian in a synthetic sense. I think that the dialectical of Hebung implies that the contradiction caused by the mediation of the presupposed statement is not eliminated, but it consists in a necessary feature of knowledge itself. From this position, it follows that without all the rest, we would not only be enabled of completing the logic, but even of beginning it. From this reason, from my point of view, the emergence of the absolute method does not overcome the presence of the rest, the negativity that the absolute idea entails, but elevates it into its content. If we understand the objective absolute against as a universal against a universal unity, therefore the absolute method would not be anymore because would be no absolute anymore because it will fall down again into absolute ideas comprehension, namely to think its own objectivity as being exempt of all contradiction, arbitrariness, error, etc. Somehow, in analogy to the beautiful soul of the phenomenology of spirit, it is never immoral, and it can blame everybody being less moral than it is. With that, the medium of the result, which the logically has methodologically made explicit, is an acceptance or an assumption of the persistence of the contradiction, leading it to a dialectical dynamic self-differentiating unity. With that, the Hegelian notion of the absolute has to be thought of as a self-differentiating movement ruled by a contradictory essence. To sum up what I have exposed, in the first place, the whole logical itinerary from the perspective of the absolute idea is considered as untruth and arbitrary negativity. We posited all the truth, and in the very moment we did so, the result was all the rest. Because if the idea does not include all the rest, it cannot be all the truth. What we have had as a result was the highest dialectical tension. With that, we reconfigured the logic by the syllogism of the method, where we could overcome this tension by realizing that the logic at the same time has a methodological form and is the method of the system. With that, content was deduced from the form and from the tension supposedly sublimated. The logical science is a system in the Kantian way, because nothing is lost or forgotten. Every element has its reason to be there. Notwithstanding, as I just said, the second methodological step of the method's form constitutes the dialectical moment of the method. And with that, it implies again arbitrariness and contradiction. In the very moment we realize that there is a change in the syllogistic sequence that brings the progression of the logic as synoptic view of all the second moments of the logic, which are characterized by the immanent negativity of the dialectical development. The synoptic awareness of the negativity that all the second moments provide is not sufficient for reaching the logic's conclusion. If we remained in this perspective, then the logic would consist in the progression of contradictions, and every one of its moments, its beginning and its end, would be defective. The second issue of my standpoint that I want to remark here is that the remaining of the rest, or the highest contradiction, is not the system's failure, but its strength. With the respect, I have also a twofold position. On the one hand, I agree with Nutso that for Hegel, the dialectic has to be recognized even when there is no logical succession, and even if its succession has been reconfigured by the method syllogism. From this point of view, I share that the logical process can be seen as a sequence of contradictions, and that it can be a problem for the conclusion of the logic if it is understood as a closure. On the other hand, I am going to try to sustain the impossibility of the logic to reach its end in view of a conclusive closure. Does not have to imply a failure of becoming a systematic science itself. Contrarily, my understanding of this issue is, and I know that it can be quite risky and maybe radical, that the possibility of an openness of the logic is not an impediment, but a requirement for its completion. Hereby, I will have to clarify the difference between completion and conclusion. Then, the scientificity of the logic, understood as the reaching of its end, implies a sublimation of the contradiction or negativity than the absolute idea entails. The standpoint that I am suggesting is that this Aufhebung of the rest performed by the synopsis provided by the absolute method does not necessarily transform it into a positive mediated term, but rather it remains and must remain as the highest opposition. This highest opposition is, in turn, caused by the dialectical tension that puts the whole logical development prospectively and retrospectively into movement. That is, the negative rest does not only remain, but it constitutes the movement of the concept itself. This should not seem strange to us, because after all, what makes a science to be a scientific and rigorous, even today, is in part the awareness of its provisionality. Therefore, I suggest here that the Hegelian logic, in order to be scientific, does not have to end and become closed, but complete. This means that it includes its rest as its truth, but as a negative one. That is, as we can see very dramatically expressed in the introduction of the phenomenology of spirit, as of the spirit. I open quote. Since it directly takes itself to be real knowledge, this path has a negative significance for it, and what is in fact the realization of the notion counts for it rather as the loss of its own self, for it does lose its truth on this path. The road can therefore be regarded as the pathway of doubt, or more precisely, as the way of despair. I close quote. The inner order of the logical forms, that is, the essence of the logic, as the method of the system, consists in assuming that every settlement of every moment has always some deficiency. That is, that it is never totally true, because if it were so, then everything that is not this settlement would again be erroneous, arbitrary, etc. All the rest. Therefore, I like to metaphorically sum up the truth that this insufficiency involves by saying that what the Hegelian method is showing us that there is space for another moment, another question, because there is no such a thing as a totally conclusive truth, but only an absolute one. That is, a comprehension that logic cannot be completed until it recognizes the openness caused by its dynamic and dialectical ground as part of its truth. My point of view of the truth of Hegelian system does not necessarily imply a bad infinite form, because what I understand by the circularity of the Hegelian system could be expressed as being the assumption, in the sense of assuming acceptation, etc., of this negative truth. That is, the impossibility of a full mediation or full manifestation of the absolute. For me, that is the knowledge of the absolute itself, absolute, that Hegel wants to make us aware of. To sustain my reading, I hereby apply it to an overview of the main movements of the circles of the logic. The two first circles of the objectivity being, in essence, in coming out from a circle that they have completed, they are resolved, Entschluss. With that, they suffer an originary springing Ursprung to initiate a new sphere, namely to expose, exteriorize in a more concrete manner the same, that is the absolute. Only in the third circle, the concept in being the circle of circles, the categories of being and of the essence self-generate. The third circle has a triadic structure, universality, particularity, and singularity, in which the former two circles can freely self-generate and self-propel due to the conscious comprehension of the former substantial necessity. In this way, it can be read in the very last paragraph of the Science of Logic that the last sphere of the subject-object, it expels itself freely, in German, sich frei entlässt, expels, in and as nature, falling down again in its original immediacy. Nevertheless, every fallen idea impregnates deeply this nature, which suddenly is blind and stupid, and which is literally out of itself, marking it with roots that are not natural but logical, and working on it on a surface which is not natural but spiritual and practical. As Hegel states in the third edition of the Encyclopedia, my open quote, the third syllogism of the idea of philosophy, which has self-knowing reason, the absolutely universal, for its middle, which divides itself into spirit and nature, making spirit the presupposition as the process of the idea's subjective activity, and nature the universal extreme as the process of the idea that is in itself objective. I close quote. Okay, and yeah. If we take Knutz's comprehension of the ends of Hegel's logic as a sublevation of this rest that was preventing the logic from reaching its end, and with that endangering it with the possibility of falling into an infinite regress and not being able to become a systematic science, then it does not only have methodological consequences, but also implications that concern, on the one hand, the architectonic of Hegelian system, and on the other hand, Hegel's textual corpus. And the first consequence of Nudge's conclusion of the article analyzed that I want to point concerns to the relationship between the logic and the Realphilosophie. I have not studied the Realphilosophie in depth yet, but I think that it is relevant for the discussion anyway. And yeah, I used to understand the categories of the logic and the logic itself as being very pure. Notwithstanding, after a serious discussion of my thesis director about the origin of these categories, he half convinced me, and I started considering the possibility of a real and historical origin of the categories. That is, and I open quote, what we can say that the sciences, language, history, etc., are negatively present in the logical development as materials that left their track and to which they return to give in a systematic sense a vitality. A close quote. In the way I understood Nudge's framework, if we read the end of the logic as the sublevation of the rest, therefore this real and historical content where the categories come from would be in turn also considered as being all the rest. Therefore, there would not be a reason for the Hegelian system to make the effort to continue with the Realphilosophie. It would remain as the method for pure abstraction. If we take this perspective, then what would be the difference between Hegel's science of logic and Fichte's doctrine of science, for example? Well, this is a question like we can discuss maybe, but I think that, yeah, it would be like a realm for abstraction or something like this. And hence, like if we take this, like Nudge's point, I think that the bond between the logic and the Realphilosophie would be always an external one. And notwithstanding, if we comprehend the absolute as a self-differentiating movement, then the logic's completion can be seen as consisting in a splitting again, but now into nature and spirit. That is, it returns to the historical origin of the concepts that the logic from where they were taken. And now I'm going to expose like the last and second consequence, and I'm finishing my paper like with this consequence. And yeah, this second consequence is more risky, I think, than the first one, but it can be interesting as well. Like, yeah, it will be worth it to give it a chance, I think. And yeah, this consequence concerns the relation between the peripheral texts and with the works that are part of the system. Like now we are like in a meta level with like texts and not like with the content of the texts and text, and yeah, like more like a textual corpus level. And yeah, the method as well as the beginning and the advancement and the end of the logic are not merely another moment or if of it or even a moment themselves. I understand like this moment of the logic as peripheral elements. Notwithstanding, I find the crucial role that they have with respect to the conclusion of the logic very curious. How is it that these peripheral elements have such a crucial role in the development and the conclusion of the logic? As we have seen, the way in which the logic is able to reach its ends and to make it necessary makes us realize that what we are considering, that we were considering the end of the logic as actually, that the end of the logic is actually its beginning, that the logic is itself the method of the system. With that, we recollected this immediate and simple beginning, which had to be posed as a presupposition, and we made the own content of the logic. Method, beginning, and end, which are peripheral issues, become the own subject matter of the logic. If we jump to a meta level, this promised meta level, and we focus on Hegel's works, all the prologues, introductions, prologues or prefaces, introductions and on the own division of the logic, the Begriff, the chapter about with what must the science begin, etc., have a very similar status as the issues that come to presence in the dialectics of the end of the logic. That is, they are inserted in a system in which they are not a part of. Namely, these texts are all the rest of Hegel's system. In my opinion, a complete and dialectical comprehension of Hegel's system in a second order level has to incorporate all these peripheral texts as well as the modifications, for example, between the two editions of the Science of Logic or between the three editions of the encyclopedias, all the hesitations, etc. And my point of view is that they contribute to a more adequate comprehension of Hegel's philosophy because somehow they represent the introduction of the materials provided by Hegel's own contexts, namely his historical context, the development of the sciences and politics of his time, etc. To the same extent as the moments of the Real Philosophie, these peripheral texts also work as indicators of the world that is being transformed and also Hegel's experience of outlining it. If we do not consider them as significant interventions of the intelligibility of the Hegelian philosophy themselves, they are then condemned to have the status of all the rest with respect to the Hegelian textual corpus. That is, the inquiries about the beginning, advancement, and end that the absolute method regathers within the system may condemn its essential moments. To the same extent, they contribute to a content, the main moments of the logical development, which they are not apart but deserve the same attention. These peripheral texts contribute to the comprehension of Hegel's philosophy in which the acceptance of his hesitations, corrections, modifications, recomposition, etc., can be the key points of a complete and thereby scientific understanding of his thoughts. And yeah, with that, thank you for having the patience of attending to my talk.
Thank you very much for that, Bruna. Okay, so Q&A. So we have our first question from Sebastian.
Hello, yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, thank you so much for your talk. It was really interesting and provocative. I was wondering what you make of the relationship between the notions of philosophy as championed by Fichte as opposed to the notion of philosophy as championed by Hegel. If Hegel in the introduction to the phenomenology of spirit says that philosophy has to be truth rather than just a love for truth or striving for truth. And I seem to remember that Fichte actually does define philosophy as a striving for truth with this kind of openness that I thought maybe you were alluding to. And so I thought, would you say maybe there are two perspectives onto truths for Hegel or onto truth itself? One is from the perspective of finite consciousness, which is similar to the Fichtean perspective. And from the perspective of finite consciousness, it's always a striving and it's always open. But then there's also this perspective of truth onto itself, which Hegel, for example, could be argued to be describing in absolute spirit. And there maybe there's less openness or different kind of openness. Or yeah, I was wondering what you were thinking about this.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I think that you posed two questions, if I understood you well. Am I right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, just to order it myself. Okay, I don't know if I got clearly the first one. Then I answered the second. I tried to answer the second one, and if you could repose the first one, please. If you I don't know if I followed you. But actually, I haven't thought about that because, as I said, I used to think the truth that is at stake in the science of logic, very independently from an anthropological truth or conscious truth. But what I understood, if we take the perspective from the finite consciousness, from the finite consciousness, which would be the phenomenology, the truth of the phenomenology, it would be much more striving, but there's this, okay, let me think. It would be much more Fichtean, as this is striving, but I think that in Hegel there's he negates or he refuses to the phenomenology, because I think that this reaching, like this kind of truth that's going on there, cannot like reach the absolute, like in a scientific sense. It's a standpoint, but if we're 50, and then this is absolute, because we're always from a finite consciousness which has this trip, and we cannot reach this absolute. It's an ideal, and I think that in the phenomenology, Hegel is starting to point. I don't agree actually that there are two kinds of truth, but the same truth. But I think that it's being too subjectivist, or too with this conception of the striving, right? I think that what Hegel is intending to do in the phenomenology is to elevate to this perspective in which the absolute is not something to reach, but something that is being, right? It's own. I understand it actually his own reality, or what it is, well, it's actually what happens at the end of the logic with this closing of the circle, right? That the absolute is what it is, and anything else. And I think that I don't think that there are two truths, but this because the second truth you are mentioning, which would be less open, no, I think it's the same kind of truth he's talking about, but but I think that the second kind of truth that you're mentioning would be less. I understand what you say, that less open, but it would be less open if we think it from the perspective of this, because I don't think that openness has to do with the impossibility of reaching it. I don't know if I am answering, but or I'm expressing myself very clearly, but well, I don't know if I maybe it's a little bit messy what I am how am I answering, but I don't think that there are two kinds of truth, that it's one truth, and it doesn't I think that the second truth maybe incorporates or integrates this openness that you can see in the phenomenology, but
Okay, thank you very much. No, that helped. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is from Angelica.
Thank you for this paper. Thank you for bringing me to further think about that passage. And I find your proposal quite interesting and intriguing. I guess my question is more clarifications of the terms, and you mentioned that also at one point. So openness, closure, and completion. And you contrast closure with completion. If you could say a little bit more about the difference between the two, and also what do you mean by openness? I mean, I am all in favor of openness, but I'm curious of how would you react to the sort of dialectical proposal? In order for the logic to be open, it must end. So it must come to an end in order to be open. And connected to that, so you're underlining this permanence of the rest, and that I also find quite interesting in your proposal. But then the question is, what is that we call a rest? The rest is something that remains over after a whole development has taken place. So somehow there is no rest when the process is just at the beginning. So somehow, if the logic is open, but is not stalling in the same place, okay, it should be possible for this rest to be somehow reabsorbed in the end and emerge again later on in the development. I don't know if it's clear what I mean. When you're, I guess I'm asking whether you think that we reach a point where the rest is always there, or if the rest is somehow something that we encounter again in different forms. I'm thinking obviously of the relation between the logic and the real philosophy. It could very well be that at the level of spirit, subjective spirit or nature, the process of actualization of the idea encounters a new rest that has to deal with, but it's not the same as what we had at the end of the logic. So I leave it there, and just feel free to pick up on any of these remarks. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Angelica, and thank you for answering me. It's very exciting for me, like, to have you here. And yeah, okay, yeah, because you posed like more than one question. And yeah, in the first place, yeah, closure, yeah, there's a like in my understanding, and I know it's a little bit risky and maybe it's something like more mind than Hegelian, I admit that. And I understand the bond, like the necessary bond between completion and openness, and opposed to closure, because I have like a little bit an obsession with the integration of the negative sides, like that it is necessary for every moment to fail to have like a progress and a development of the logic. Like, I don't know if I express myself clearly, but with that, because the movement is a dialectical one and not another one, I understand it as, yeah, I bond the openness with the dialectic, like with the dialectical moment, with dialectics itself. And yeah, it would be like more like that the truth of the system, or what Hegel wants to point, is not like to reach an absolute or a standpoint in which like everything is very clear, or yes, but as I understand it, more that we like, what makes this clearness is to accept that we don't know everything, like we can, like, that knowledge can fail and knowledges can fail and can be provisional. This is what I understand for an openness, and like that there's always a space for one more question and one more, like, one more inquiry, like one more question. Yeah, exactly. And I pose it against to closure, because what I understand for closure, like that something like it's done, it's like we can put the check, like, and I think it wouldn't, like, there are no scientific theories or proposals that can, like, that can say that they have this kind of a status, right? Then, and I understand Hegel's like project as being very, very scientific and like much more realist than idealist, for example, right? And yeah, this on the one hand, I don't know if I expressed myself clearly, and on the other hand, I haven't thought of in your option, like taking this, like your question that you posed, that if should be possible for this rest to be reabsorbed and re-encountered again. I haven't thought about it, and I will have to, actually, because I understand like this rest as being like the pure negative, like not pure negative, it sounds very metaphysical, right? But yeah, this tension that is marking or remembering, making us remember all the time that this knowledge is provisional, right? Then I have to think about it, and like I'm just starting to work with that, then I'll do that. But I don't know if this, it could be thought that this rest is reabsorbed and we can encounter it again, but if we're in the first, like in the logic and we observe it, which like how would we like feel like the necessity to follow with the further system, like with like we have been finished, right? But if we like are in this end and like we feel that okay, this is maybe too pure, or we are like, yeah, we are like in one, like in one of the perspective of knowledge, or in one determinate knowledge, if it is truly scientific, how we can, I don't know, like I don't know if I'm expressing like well, but how could we know that we reach this end, like if we are not God, for example, or something like that? I don't know. I have to think more about that, but and I think that it's like, yeah, something that I have to take in account, but I don't know if I share it. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. I have a question, and it's about, so I've got a few questions. The first question is about this idea of what's sort of left over, what's resting, or what's sort of, yeah, the rest. And I wonder, to what extent is it the case that from the very beginning of the logic, I mean, maybe after being, every step onwards, we're always looking back at the rest. We're always looking back at what's already come, and we're always already thinking of the moment that we're presently at as the moment that has come after all that has come before. And to what extent is that, and how is that different, in your opinion, to the final moment in the absolute idea? Is that clear?
Could you like I don't understand if you say like, if I don't understand if there are two questions or one, like because I don't know if you are meaning like that, if this like backwards perspective or synoptic perspective is in every moment of the logic, or if it's in the end. You're asking that.
I'm asking, yeah, I guess it's first, is it in every moment? And if it is, in what sense is it different to the sense in the end, where Hegel really emphasizes it, where he actually really sort of thematizes the problem or the thing?
Yeah, okay. I think that it is somehow implicit in every moment, but we don't know it. Like, this is my answer, you know, like, because actually what is made explicit at the end of the logic is the method, right? Which was immanently working when we didn't know it, right? Then it is in there, but I don't think that we're aware of it, like in every moment, you know. This is the difference, I think. Then, yeah, yeah, like, well, yeah, I'm having like, I'm thinking on Angelica's question, like, yeah, because this could be considered as a reobserving of the rest, actually, like, because it is like it's a new and different standpoint, right? Yeah, sure. But yeah, that's my answer, and I'm reconnecting it to Angelica Nunes, which makes me like a lot of thinking. Thank you, everyone.
Can I ask just a quick follow-up as well?
Sure.
It's not really related to the question that I asked, but anyway.
Please.
I really like what you're doing with the idea of completeness and openness, because there are lots of accounts of the move from logic to nature. And here I'm thinking of people like Edward Harper and William Maker, who really who tried to say that the logic is sort of closed and that it's done. And then there's sort of like this move into nature. And I think what they miss is that they fail to treat the whole as we've treated the parts of the whole. And I think you're really right there to think that we shouldn't treat the absolute idea or the absolute method as just this mediated term, but it's actually this immediacy itself that is open to further. I think that's really like bang on the money. One thing I wonder is if this is your reading for the logic to, or from logic to nature implicitly, is this also your reading for the whole of the system? Is it that once the system ends, the system itself is still open to new things, to new logical possibilities? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, well, actually, is what I am like planning to do with my doctoral thesis. Then I'm just beginning, but yeah, this is what I'm intending. Yeah, this is like my point, or what I am intending. Like I intend to think. Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Yeah, and with the Hegelian whole system. But I think that because because there's this thing that, and he like, I think that he says it like quite like repeatedly, that the logic has to, or categories have to evolve like together with the historical and scientific categories or concepts or ideas or like facts, like at the same time. That he says something like, we cannot like think in terms of force if Newton like weren't there, like with his theory, like that there's and I think that like I don't know, that that it doesn't end, it remains open, and the truth of the system is precisely like a negative truth. Like I don't know if if you understand me. I absolutely agree with that. Yeah, and this is actually what I want to do.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, our next question is from Filip.
Thank you, Bruna, for your paper. So I have a question about the notion of science. So I have like, well, it seems to me like there is a tension going on if we view what Fichte and Hegel are doing in the same vein as natural science and what's going on in there. So I can sort of get behind the idea that what natural science is doing, like their theses are sort of provisional, right? You have a hypothesis and you have to do experiments and so on. But this is all, seems to me, is owed to because the object is, or the content is relative and external to the form. This cannot be the case in philosophy, I think. So I'm wondering whether it wouldn't be helpful to distinguish science into like natural scientific science and philosophical science. And I wonder if you have anything to say about that. Because if we have, if what philosophy deals with is provisional, then it seems to me we run into problems immediately at the very outset of logic. So, just to put it like in a cheeky way, right? If pure being is the case at the beginning of logic, if it's provisional, it's not really pure being. It might be pure being, but we don't know. And so there seems to me already a kind of a gap between form and content there, and that is kind of like what we should have overcome already going into presuppositionist thinking or like philosophy as such, right? So I'm wondering if that is the kind of provisionality you were talking about, or am I sort of completely off base here with regards to that?
Okay, thank you, Philip. If I understand you well, you were asking me between the difference, like if there are two kinds of sciences, like if there's a difference between science and philosophical science, and if philosophy is a science, then it has problems, right? This is what are you asking me? Like
yes, if it's exactly like natural science.
If it's exactly, okay, yeah, got it. But you are you differentiating logic from philosophy? I didn't like. I don't have it clear.
No.
Okay. Yeah. Then it's like let me think, because on the one hand the notions of science and philosophy could be thought differently from empirical science, but I think that the difference comes like from the object or the kind of object. But precisely this provisionality, I think that has to be, it has to be common between gathers both, I think, like the object, in yeah, in empirical sciences, I think that the objects and conclusions are like of a one kind, like, and in philosophy, the problem is that we don't have conclusions, or I think that it is so, like, but I don't think that this affects to the provisionality of the results, like, because, yeah, I don't have like very clear answer to that, but yeah, because it would be like, yeah, the sense of sight, because you put like, you pointed the provisional, like this aspect, the provisionality feature, but I think that both that empirical sciences and philosophy, like what makes them science is the fact that they are like justified wholes, like with an inner idea. Actually, in this sense, I'm thinking like in the way, yeah, I think that maybe empirical sciences would be less scientific in Fichte's or Hegel's and these idealist terms than philosophy, actually, because I don't know if we can say that empirical sciences have this inner idea, or maybe it's what the, maybe in the philosophy of nature, like Hegel will build. Yeah, I don't like, I don't know actually, because I think that in some aspects, yes, we would be talking the same kind of science or the same scientific knowledge. But on the other hand, because the object is very different, it affects the notion of the science. I think that they are not the same. Yeah, but I don't think like, because you said that pure being would be provisional or something like that, you said there. Like the first, yeah, actually, yeah, Hegel has like always this problem, like the difference between Hegel or Hegel's notion of science and like a common notion of science would be that in the common or empirical sciences sense, there's no problem of putting like hypotheses or actions or departing from an unjustified point, but for Hegel it does. And it has to do with the sense of science that comes from Kant and yeah, the architectonics and so on, you know, like this is why I am telling you that in a very idealist or Kantian, Fichtean, Hegelian sense, empirical sciences wouldn't be like, yeah, scientific as philosophy. I don't know if I answered you more or less.
Well, it's a very difficult question, and I mean, it helps what you're saying. I mean, it could be that the logic is provisional in some sense. It's just we need to get correct about which sense that is. It's just that, you know, the immediate worry I have with that is that we lose definitiveness, right? Which poses a skeptical philosophical issue, that what we're thinking when we're thinking is not really thinking. We're just imagining that we're thinking, right? And that seems really, you know, wrong, you know, like we lose actuality in what we're doing. But anyway, thank you very much for that. I'll, you know, let somebody else carry on.
Okay, thank you, Philip. George.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I just have a few comments, hopefully somewhat helpful. I think one thing that might help you from the start is to get very clear about what is meant precisely by the absolute, because I think you're picking up on something here, which is the connotation of the absolute as somehow this complete epistemic certainty, which I think is how we will tend to often interpret Hegel in a sort of epistemological vein, right? So it's like, well, you know, the absolute, you know, so the kind of premise behind the idea of there's no more, the system is closed, is there's no more room for questioning, right? There's no more room for any sort of further project of inquiry or something like that, because it's closed in this sort of epistemic sense, right? But as in we know it completely. But I don't think Hegel is interested in epistemology in that way. I think that's sort of what you're teasing out, right? So the question of, you know, might there be, you know, so there are other aspects to the logic, or, you know, might there be moments that are implicit that, you know, weren't brought out or so forth. You know, I don't think Hegel spends a lot of time worrying about that, right? You kind of, you know, it doesn't seem to be a major concern of his, you know, insofar as, you know, what he's doing is, you know, he sees as, you know, necessary and, you know, self-mediated, and, you know, all the methodological sort of descriptions he gives of what he's doing. But, you know, I don't think that he thinks that it's complete in the sense of there'll be no more philosophy after this, right? This is like a really common Hegel pitfall, which is analogous to sort of the end of history idea, right? And, you know, I had a professor once saying like, oh, well, you know, Hegel's known for, you know, the absolute's the end of history. And you're like, oh, go read the philosophy of history. He makes very modest claims about what he thinks we can know about, you know, what's going to happen historically. So, you know, I think this idea of sort of really bringing out the difference between, you know, completion and an end, right? Or whatever terms you ultimately want to use, right? The idea of there being a sort of, you know, stopping point for thought. I don't think he means that, right? And I think you're right to bring that out. You know, so because this is sort of the challenge from people who maybe have a more epistemic background in philosophy, right? They're going to come and say, well, you know, you have this closed system, it's ultimately dogmatic, right? But, you know, I think Hegel's just not operating in those terms, right? So, and that brings out everything you said about how, you know, the absolute, you know, is, so knowledge is absolute, but not in that sense sort of dogmatically closed. So I think some terminological clarification would go a long way. And also just, yeah, I mean, a general sense of, you know, Hegel, I think, is ultimately proceeding from being and sort of wanting to leave behind the epistemology wars and all the questions of when do we have final certainty as opposed to, you know, provisional certainty. I think, you know, he wants to bring that all into the question of being. And, you know, when we read him in this epistemic way, that's when these sort of problems of, you know, misreading the absolute arise. But thank you so much for the presentation.
Yeah, yeah, I think, George, that I agree with you. I don't think like maybe you had like this, like you understood me like this, but I don't think that I am interested in an epistemic approach of the absolute, like, or an epistemic reading of the absolute actually. But yeah, for clarification, I think it's really like, yeah, I'm sure I have to do that. Yeah, what actually I understand or want to understand as the, as the absolute is more like something non-relative, and but which is well, actually the absolute, or well, yeah, in a more like more realistic than idealistic way, you know, like as reality itself, like what it is, and because it's being, you know, like, but it's not like, because I think that when like we tend to understand the absolute in Hegel, like more than epistemically, I think that too much metaphysically, you know, like to, yeah, the apps like this like metaphysical mystery or something like that, or this, yeah, final totality, and like, yeah, this, yeah, more like this super ecstasies or something like that. But what I am like, I understand Hegel as trying to like to approach to reality, to the comprehension of reality itself, you know, like, and for this reason the absolute is something like very complicated to think, because conceptually, like from a like the perspective of a finite consciousness or finite language, or the possibility of language, and like it's a concept that doesn't let like it's not like comprehension, like fully comprehensional, right? But like reality itself, like, I don't know. And I think that at this point, Hegel is much more, realistic. And and I prefer like, to understand it in a sense that non-relative, but this non-relativeness could be understood more like in a sense of that we accept that, like that's it's a metaphysical inquiry more than an epistemic one, but I understand it in a more realistic way, maybe, like that it's just only reality, normal questions, like, something like, but it's something that I am right now reading about and trying to build something with it and a clear position. And thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Bruna, thank you once again for your paper. And thank you everyone for your questions. And I hope to see you all next week for Sebastian Stein's paper, Hegel's Notion of Philosophy. And have a good week, and we'll see you all next week.